Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got some food laid out here. It's just some frozen apple skins, some potato skins. I think there's a few scraps of strawberry in there, and there's also the customary box full of used coffee. There's a couple other things over here. The grit, got some pulverized eggshell. I've replenished my supply because I was running low. As well as some tattered up pieces of paper. In this case, it's just some coffee filters that I'm going to use as bedding to go with the feeding. And the bins that are getting fed today are my European night crawlers. One of the bins is the white bin, which is, I believe, 32 days of age at this point. Not too old yet. I think it's already had about 5 feedings, so still a fairly new bin. It was kind of light when I picked it up to bring it out here onto the table. And the other bin that we're feeding is not even a bin, it's a bag. It's the VERMIBAG Mini. And this bag has been in service for I don't even know how long, 550 plus days, maybe longer, 560. So we're going to get to feeding these things. Go grab a glove and we'll get to work. The feedings in this container have been fairly routine in past weeks and months. The only thing different is the fact that I've now added this secondary piece of plastic covering. The temperatures are dropping, so my forced hot air heat has been coming on more regularly, and it's usually that time of year when I worry that maybe it's the heat that's causing the dryness in the air, or maybe it's just the fact that it's winter closing in. So I just want to make sure I maintain the moisture levels in my bins as much as I can. The main thing that you see right away is an attempt that I made last week to really beef up the amount of carbon in this bin, amount of bedding. So I took a whole pile of scrap paper bag that I had shredded, and I stacked it right on top over here to see what we end up with before placing those plastic sheets on top. And you can see that the moisture in the bin has collected nicely within a lot of this paper. I think it's just the paper on the very outer edges, where the edges of the plastic don't cover things as well, where there was a little bit more ventilation happening, allowing the paper to remain a little bit drier out on the edges. But right beneath where the paper was, I'm tempted to just remove this paper. It's just such a big pile of paper. Get it out of our way. But since we kind of feed down the middle usually, I think we've made ourselves enough room here to put a little bit more food in here. I usually try to go a little bit below the surface when I'm feeding. A lot of people just say throw it in. I like to try to submerge the food a little bit if I can, because if not for those plastic coverings, there's pretty much nothing protecting this this bin's contents from the air above. So that would mean any little flying insects that might sense a food supply in here would be drawn in and could potentially invade and colonize this container, which I don't want to have happen. It's happened in the past, so I used to really have a struggle in here with little gnats or fruit flies or whatever they were coming in here to make their home, take advantage of the food supply. But more recently, since I've been trying to make sure that the food is sunken down pretty deep, I've not really encountered that problem lately. Knock on wood, hopefully it stays that way. My hope was to excavate a little bit of a hole here to place today's feeding into. So I want to have some nice clean material that we could use to cover up with at the end. But you can already see right away there's scraps of the previous feeding in here, which was 6 days ago, and I wondered if it was too soon to come back in here. I mean, there's definitely leftovers in here, scraps of this and that, but nothing major. I think adding more food today is not going to be a problem. just want to be able to kind of isolate the stuff that I pulled out so I can put it right back in at the end. I'll try to keep it all right here in this little pile. I'll try to get back into the hole when we're done feeding. After we apply the fresh food, we'll just put the older stuff that we pulled out on top of that. I'm definitely going down deep at this point. There was a point there for a while I was not letting myself dig down into this bin. I was kind of forcing myself to top feed this container, and maybe that was part of the reason I was getting a lot of flying insects, because I wasn't submerging the food down. I've allowed myself to get back into the deep digging again in here to make sure I sink the food that I'm adding down low enough so that it doesn't cause the infiltration of animals or creatures, insects. So we've got a good amount of apple peel in here, as well as some potato peel. Pretty generous portion. Before I added it, I had also placed in a little bit of shredded up paper as a little bit of a bedding underneath the food. And we're just going to pile in the old food that we found as we started digging. All right, we've got ourselves a pretty good feeding in here. So before we put all this bedding back on top, I've also got some grit we could throw in here, as well as coffee. I like the coffee going in at the end because it feels like I'm covering things up and sort of masking the scent of the food, and hopefully the bugs don't get attracted to it. I spent a little time creating some more pulverized eggshell a couple days ago, so I've got a nice supply again. It may have been a couple weeks now since I last added grit into this container, so even though it's probably got plenty scattered throughout it from months and months of routine feedings, every now and then I like to add some fresh pulverized eggshell as grit for these guys. Yeah, here and there I'm feeling like a piece of old mango seed, the shell of it. Here's like an old banana peel. There's all kinds of bits and pieces of older feeding scraps all over the place in here. This might be a piece of potato. Let's get this little guy back down in there. Alrighty. What do we got over on this side? Not bad. Seems to me like this having this this paper on top did a nice job becoming a place for the moisture that comes off of the feeding to get caught. So I think just the nature of the moisture in the bin is that it wants to try to evaporate and get airborne. So the plastic captures it, and then this paper right below that ends up becoming a nice place for that moisture to collect. And you can see all the castings all throughout this paper, showing that the worms have been cruising around through it and hanging out in it, and along the way depositing their castings within it. So we'll create a nice little pile in the middle for them to hang out in again. So this bin has definitely got a nice generous amount of bedding right now, which is kind of where I wanted it to be. It felt to me like for a while I was a little bit skimpy on the bedding. So I think that this big pile of paper in the middle is a nice boost. Alright. Get our plastic coverings back in place. Keeping that moisture down in the bin, which is where we want it. Alright, let's get the other bin fed. The first thing I'm noticing is this little flying insect in here. And before I thought I saw one cruising around right below the plastic as well, so I hope we're not going to be faced with a huge infestation here once we get these plastic and cardboard coverings removed. My hope was that by covering up this way we prevent any sort of intrusion, but who knows, I could be causing the exact opposite, creating a nice little hiding spot for them to burrow down into. So I'm just going to grab these little scraps of paper that stuck to the plastic there and get them back in place. Because as nice as this piece of paper was, a sort of a top covering for the worms to hang out on, it does seem like it's, yeah, it seems like its structural integrity is shot. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and piece it up. Just include these little chunks of paper to go with the feeding. Oh, making myself dirty here. Usually try to keep one clean hand so I can use that to control the camera and stuff. Alright, so the last feeding would have been down the middle, which is my my typical mode. Unless I decide for some reason to switch things up a little bit. Seems like we got some leftover bits and pieces of potato here. These look like bits and pieces of the cardboard that was originally used to build the bin. I recognize them. They're the parts of the egg carton that make up the bottom with those little circles on them. So with this bin still being relatively young, a lot of the cardboard bits and the leafy matter that was used to originally build the bin is still here. But I'm sure it's just a matter of time before it starts to get broken down. The moisture level in here is pretty nice. Nice and cozy, the way the worms like it. I believe it's that way because of the plastic coverings that were keeping all the dampness within the material. Here and there I'm encountering some of these older bits of food that they've received from, I don't know when. This probably came in with the worms or came over from their previous container. These are parts of a mango seed. Pretty far along in terms of it being deteriorated. Just the fact that it tears this easily and stuff like that. It's, oops, I'm launching bits and pieces of material all over my bench over here. Let's get this stuff back in the bin. So yeah, some of this stuff just came over with the worms from their previous habitat. What do we got here? Here's some of the paper, same stuff that we saw in the VermiBag Mini. Some of the same shredded paper that had been placed in under the food as bedding. I guess we'll see if we can maybe keep some of it around to reuse it as bedding for the new feeding. But we've also got some of this paper that was top covering we could throw in here. Some of these old bits of food that we found along the way, these mango seed shells. And we've also got some of this shredded coffee filter too. So it's pretty good bedding for underneath the feeding zone. I'm just gonna kind of spread it out here because we don't have a very deep system here yet. It's a fairly new system and I tried to start kind of shallow, so it's not very deep quite yet. And that's maybe part of the reason we've got flying insects making their way into here, because they, you know, they can sense the food. It's just not deep enough for me to bury it all. So here's what remains. Gosh, it feels like we've given this bin a whole lot more than we gave the VermiBag Mini. It's a lot of apple peels and potato peels. Stuff which doesn't really usually get consumed right away, so I'm wondering how long it's going to take before we start seeing signs of this stuff breaking down. We might have to withhold feedings on this bin for a little while and let them get caught up. So I've got a little bit of coffee left here. Hopefully it helps us mask the scent of the sweet apple and yummy foods that are being placed in here to keep the curious flying insects out. Although I already saw signs of them hanging out in here, so chances are they're going to continue to come in here and try to make themselves at home. Out here on the far edges of the bin is probably where we're going to find some of the old food scraps from previous feedings. You saw as I was making an opening here, I was kind of pushing things to the side, and I think that's just where the older foods sort of end up when I start excavating a hole for adding new stuff. The old stuff just seems to get pushed outboard. So it's not surprising that the worms are really digging it out there. I'm sure we're going to see a similar situation out here on this far edge. Yeah, look at that. It seems like we got so many more worms hanging out on the far edges of this bin where the old food scraps can be found. The new food scraps probably require a bit of time before the worms can eventually get at them. They need a little bit of time to start breaking down and decomposing before the worms can actually take advantage of it. So more recently I've been noticing that the worms definitely seem to prefer the outskirts of my bins, which is where most of the older foods wind up. I'm liking the idea of doing what we saw in the VermiBag Mini, which is to give them even more bedding. Because you saw leftover bedding from previous feedings, you saw leftover bedding from the build of the bin. We added bedding. We even recycled that top cover piece of paper to create bedding, but I'm wondering if rather than replacing that top sheet of paper, if we can go with what the VermiBag Mini has in it, which is just a big bunch of that shredded paper piled up on top. I hope it doesn't end up becoming a haven for flying insects if I do it. But I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to grab a handful of that stuff and place that across the top as our top cover. I've got a fairly good amount of it here. I shredded up a couple of those leaf collection bags that the township gives you. They were older ones that had been sitting out there for some time. And I let them dry, and then I shook off all the debris that was on them so that I could run them through my paper shredder. So I think this should be a nice cozy spot for the worms to come up and hang out in. The stuff will start picking up some of the moisture that kicks off of the frozen food we just added as it starts to thaw. Rather than just evaporating, it'll get caught by the plastic and end up falling down onto this paper and becoming a nice cozy spot for the worms to hang out in. I'm sure we'll start seeing castings developing within this material pretty soon. It just becomes kind of a cushy, flexible material right below the plastic. It just makes it a little bit more difficult for me to try to go right out to the edges to make sure we're well covered. It doesn't seem to matter. I think the little flying insects are going to make their way in there whether we like it or not. Luckily we didn't see too many of them, but hopefully this doesn't cause a little bit of an outbreak. I'm going to keep my fingers crossed, hopefully it doesn't. So I managed to remain pretty clean here. The moisture levels when they're really high result in me getting material stuck all over my gloves, but it seems like we've got a pretty good balance, pretty much where I like it. I like to feel the moisture within the material. You can see that it's got a good moisture content to it when we're picking around through it, but not so high that it makes things muddy and sticky and nasty. So this is a pretty good level. I think we're done here. So before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. that's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.